So shalom again to everyone. Welcome to the Or Beit Midrash. We're continuing with Masechet Makkot, and I was just saying that there are mitzvot in Torah that are aseh, to do them, and lo ta'aseh, thou shalt not. And when it comes to the idea that we have any commentary on those mitzvot, we have an age's worth of library of books and commentaries that exist. In the Gemara already, there are certain kinds of categorization and ways of approaching thinking about those mitzvot. Yes, there are mitzvot aseh. Yes, there are mitzvot lo ta'aseh. There are mitzvot that we do, mitzvot we don't do. But the other way to think about that is, okay, there are mitzvot that have this penalty. There are mitzvot that carry that penalty. There are mitzvot that carry this penalty. And there are mitzvot that carry that penalty. And then there are punishments or results of our behaviors. And we ask about those kinds of results of our behaviors, not only in a punishment kind of category, but in a philosophy kind of way. What's the result of my action? Is it that I, quote unquote, do it for the sake of doing it? Do I gain a reward, or do I have to pay a certain price when I don't accomplish my mission? What are the consequences? What are the natural consequences? And so a lot of times we see and read Torah with the mind's eye that, oh, this is about the people who are evil and they didn't do this, or they did it and now they have to be punished and they get this resultant punishment. Of course, Makkot means lashes. And lashes, if it's really delivered in a really painful way, lashes are terrible and it's corporal punishment. Imagine the symbolic set of lashes, whack, kind of like this, right? Part of me thinks the rabbis are thinking about lashes, not just in we're going to now say the court decided and sentenced this criminal to 40 lashes, but it's kind of looking at everyday Jews and saying, no good. No good. And think about being, quote unquote, disciplined by the very notion that there are crimes. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to chapter 2. Here in chapter 2, we're still in a post-Sanhedrin kind of afterburner effect, where we're talking about murder. But we're talking about a different kind of killing. We're talking about inadvertent killing. We're talking about involuntary manslaughter. We're talking about manslaughter. We're not talking about first-degree homicide. We're going to go back to there to start. Because even though I said all I said about the punishments in search of crimes and the discipline of thinking about lashes that are not just the sentences of courts, but the kind of overlaying part of rabbinic philosophy to say, you really have to take seriously the notion that you could transgress and that you'll be held accountable. But before we get there in the next chapter, which we're going to get to at a good point during the year, we're going to start back where we were with this manslaughter, with this inadvertent killing, with what the Torah says about the punishments and the exile of the manslaughterer versus the murderer who is sentenced to death. And we're going to remember, for the sake of tonight, and jump right in, that we have Are Miklat, several cities around the entire land of ancient Israel that are refuge cities, cities of refuge. But those cities of refuge are better defined, as we said, as penal colonies of sorts. And if you will, those colonies are like settlements, because we already saw that they have marketplaces, they have yeshivas. And by the way, certain Rabbanim like to hang around in those yeshivas a little bit more than they are staying on the outside in Pumbedita or Sura, Babylonian cities where there were major academies. They like the notion. Let's move into that kind of crazy place where, we don't know exactly what the nature is there. Torah study can help redeem. What ultimately frees someone? Remember, we learned in Mishnah, what ultimately frees the manslaughterer after he's paid his price to society, after he's committed the crime and goes to the city of exile and does his time. If you recall, it was the death of the Kohen Gadol that freed up this manslaughter. And that is the issue we kind of are going to see first, back to our real inyan, back to our real topic. But we're going to start in an area of the text that is perfect for the restart of Talmud study and Torah study, because you're always studying Torah when you're studying Talmud. Talmud Torah, Keneged Kulam. The study of Torah is equal to them all. And we're going to start on 11a in the Gemara. And that is going to be on screen in a minute. Yud, that's Daf Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. And over here, Carol, page 70, if you want to be with me in the English Hebrew side.
Yeah. Oh, starting the English.
Trying to go to Yud Aleph.
Scrolling through. Okay. Now,
The first words.
I'm gonna tell you in a second. V'yichtov Yehoshua, or Plige ba Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbanan.
What's the English?
The Gemara resumes the discussion. We're in 2 paragraphs from the bottom, Carol. Plige. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. You're on Daf Tet. Yud Aleph. Okay, we're just getting our places in the Beit Midrash here. So hold on one second.
On the screen, but I'd like to follow the book.
Yeah, here we go. Okay, over here. Vayichtov Yoshua. Okay.
So, can I ask something about the dress of the kind?
No, we're gonna get there.
Oh,
We're gonna get back there. Okay. So before we start and get to the death of the Kohen Gadol that frees the manslaughterer from being a captive of sorts in the exiled city, we're going to be in this part here where the Gemara resumes this discussion of some harsh language. It was talking about some harsh language, and they want to blame Joshua for there being harsh language. The rabbis disagree. One says harsh language was employed because Joshua delayed fulfilling the mitzvah of designating cities of refuge. In other words, we needed these cities of refuge. We had talked last year, for those who were here, about whether or not we put cities of refuge into play right away when they got to the east side of the Jordan River, or they waited until they conquered the land, and Joshua then had to put all 6 into play. And so that was a whole big discussion. Well, Vayichtov Yoshua et hadivarim ha'ele b'sefer Torat Elohim. So it's written in Joshua chapter 24. And remember, Joshua is an interesting book of Torah because it's like the 6th book of Torah. It's an interesting book in Tanakh because it's really connected to Moses, who appoints Yehoshua in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, and says, Joshua, you're the leader, and you're going to take this people into the land. And we kind of feel like the book of Joshua, Sefer Yehoshua, in the Tanakh, is a culmination of the promise and the function of Am Yisrael, the promise given by God and the function of Am Yisrael in terms of really inheriting the land of Israel for us. And so Yehoshua puts this in the Torah of God, right? Well, wait a minute. Is that Yehoshua writing records in the time of Yehoshua, meaning post-Torah? Or is that Yehoshua filling in verses in a Torah scroll in which there's like blank space? Because we're talking about verses about the city of refuge. We're talking about verses that maybe Moses is dying. So where is he writing? Exactly what verses is he writing exactly where is he writing verses of Torah? Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah disagree. So what we have a machloket between the two of them. Chad omer shmona psukim v'chad omer arei miklat. The reason I said that he might be writing about Moses' death, he might be writing about the cities of refuge, is because this is the very machloket of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah regarding Joshua's writing anything in the Torah. But both of them agree from the get-go, right? This is how they're relating to it. There were certain verses that Joshua wrote into the Torah. Now, what is so fascinating about even that Hava Amina? What's so fascinating about that possibility, right, is that we say Torah LaMoshe Sinai. Torah came to Moses on Sinai. But here, who's getting Torah and who's writing it? Joshua. So the rabbis have the ability to believe at the same time that everything was whispered to Moshe and Moshe gave Torah exactly as God gave it to the great teacher Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. At the same time, Talmudically, we hold out the possibility that Joshua actually wrote certain psukim into the text. Now, how is that? Well, you could say Pirkei Avot says it all, right? Because Pirkei Avot, at the beginning of chapter 1 of the Mishnah Pirkei Avot, which is not in our books here, but in the background, Pirkei Avot is now ringing in our ears. What does Pirkei Avot say? Moses Masarah Lioshua. Moses sent all the Torah down through Joshua. And Joshua, obviously, Baal Peh, he knew the Torah by memory. So we get the sequence there in Pirkei Avot, and then Joshua to the Zekanim actually, and then the Zekanim come and bring it down to the next generations. Okay, so here though, there is a possibility that Joshua is the one to quote unquote fill out the Torah. Bishlama lamanda amar shmona psukim. So granted, according to the one who says that the final 8 verses in the Torah were written by Joshua, why is it Bishlama? Why would one say that? Because here's the reason: the Hainu Dichtiv b'Sefer Torat Elohim, and Joshua wrote the matters in the scroll of the Torah of God. Whose Torah is it there? It reverts, if you will, or it is determined and it is emphasized that it is the Torah of God we're talking about, not the Torah of Moshe. This is God's Torah that we need Joshua to write and fill out the last 8 verses. So fine, Gemara says, Elo lamanda amar are miklat. But what about the one who says about the cities of refuge, right? Because that's not in the end of the Torah. That's back in Deuteronomy, several chapters before the end of Torah. My b'sefer Torat Elohim. So what is it about Sefer Torat Elohim? How do you basically understand the reference in the book of Joshua that it's a Sefer Torah of God if it's the Arei Miklat, which we know is Moses' teaching, or we thought was Moses' teaching. Hachi Kamar. So this is what the phrase means. V'yichtov Yehoshua b'sifro et ha'devarim ha'ele ha'ketuvim b'sefer Torat Elohim. Joshua wrote in his book what was already written in the Torah of God. It does make sense, right? Because the Torah of God is given, according to our tradition, Moses wrote and passed along everything. And then Joshua, who comes to record all of what's doing in a different way than Torah's status as the Torah Misinai. He writes what's in Torah Elohim, and he writes it into his book. And if that's what we really understand about the cities of refuge that he goes over and the cities of refuge that he's learning about because it's already written in the Torah, it's fine. That's what we do. Now, the Gemara goes, and now it's going to say another dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and one of the sages. And now, since we're talking about Torah and kind of how it's put together and how we really understand this physical document and this written word of God and the Jewish people, we also want to get a picture of the actual scroll. We want to get a picture of what's written in the scroll. We want to understand and relate to the text, but we also want to understand the physical manifestation of that text and what makes it kosher. We have to understand it in a kosher way. We have to present it in a kosher way, and we need Jewish law about presenting it. So, Sefer Shetfaro B'Fishtan Pligi Bar Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Meir. They want to now argue about a Torah scroll where one is sewn with linen threads versus sinew, versus the kind of stretched muscle fiber of animals. Chad omer kasher, v'chad omer pasul. Can you stitch together a Torah with linen threads? And only one sheet, by the way, is stitched together with linen thread. Now, what happened here? Let's say what happened behind the scenes. What happened? There's a Torah scroll. We're in shul. We're reading. We have a little shul in the Galilee. We have a Torah scroll, thank God. And it's at a time that all the chumashim are sewn together. Or maybe each chumash we have separately as a scroll itself, like the 5 scrolls of Moses. Either which way, you have yiriyot. A panel that a Torah is written on is called a yiriyah. And how are they sewn together? There are laws about how they're sewn together. And it's supposed to be with sinew. But if I have a kind of linen thread around that I've used to sew my linen garment, let's say, because, right, I can't use wool, I can't use yarn and linen together, because that's a commandment of the Torah. So,
Why?
because wool and linen don't mix, and there's no why. It's chok, it's shatnez. But I have linen thread. I'm not a scribe. I don't have sinew. I don't have these very unique kind of threads, but my Torah came apart. So I sewed one place in the Torah. I sewed it together. Does that make it puzzle? Does that make it unfit for use? Or does that allow me to keep my Torah together and use it like I would any other day? There's a disagreement between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. One says the Torah scroll's fit for use. One says the Torah scroll's unfit for use. Now, by the way, this could be a very real occurrence. One panel in our Torah happens to be very loose. Okay? So the question is, okay, someone does Hagbah, and it gets even looser. All the scroll is on the left side. We pick somebody who's not a lefty. This is a little strategizing, by way of Gabai's work, in order to get the right guy to lift up the Torah, or the right woman who's ready to do Gabba, is ready to do Hagbah. So it gets a little looser. Do I have to really salvage that piece of sinew, that particular thread that is in the Torah scroll, and try to put it back in through the holes that are punched when that original Torah scroll was made? Because there's a little, I think it's called an awl, right? That boom, 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 boom makes the holes. Or can I use some other kind of thread that I have around in order to really hold it together? So the Gemara elaborates. Lamandam apostle, the one who says it's unfit for use. Dichtiv lamanti yeh Torat Hashem b'ficha. as it's written, he says, with regard to the phylacteries, with regard to tefillin, it should be a sign on your hand, a memorial between your eyes, in order that Torah of God shall be in your mouth. Ve'itakash kol Torah kula litfillin. And in this verse, the Torah is really juxtaposed with the entirety of the tefillin and what's potentially either written in tefillin or the notion of understanding the tefillin verse. Ma tefillin halacha l'Moshe misinai, just like tefillin have certain ways you build them, and they have to have a certain very, very detailed way of constructing the boxes and how the boxes are actually sewn together in order to hold the scrolls within the slots. So too, I learn that Torah has a very specific way that it must be constructed, sewn together. And if I do that, then the answer is obvious. Ma tefillin halacha l'Moshe misinai. So tefillin are legally created only because I understand the laws as Moshe spoke them. L'tofran begidin. That is, I have to sew them with sinews. Af kol l'tofran begidin. Every panel of the Torah scroll has to be sewn together with sinew. Ve'idach, and the other one says, ki itakash lamutar b'ficha lehilchotav lo itakash. With regard to the principle that the sheets of the Torah scroll may be prepared only from a species of animal that's permitted to your mouth, that is permitted for a Jew to eat. But with regard to its other halachot, it's really not juxtaposed and likened to tefillin. In other words, the second opinion holds, I don't see as detailed a halacha in the way that Torah scrolls are sewn together as I do with the tefillin. Now, where I do see the parallel is that just like tefillin have to be from a kosher beast that I'm able to eat, so too the panels of Torah themselves have to be from a kosher animal that I can eat. But I don't really say the same thing about the sewing together nature of the Torah scroll itself. Amarav, Rav says, Hazenan lahu l'tfilin devei chavivi. This is like one of these classic ways that you end a Gemara before another Mishnah, especially after machlokets. There's no like, here's the halachic opinion, and now we're done. But someone comes along, in this case Rav, and he says, you want to know what I saw once by the house of my uncle, Rav Chia? Huh. The Tifir Bechitana. That they actually they had a Torah that was sewn together with linen. The late Hilchata Kavate. Oh, but here is a ruling halachically, but the halacha is not in accordance with his opinion. Phylacteries may be sewn only together with sinew. So the argument ends not about the Torah, if you will, but someone proposing that they should take proof from the fact that tefillin themselves were put together with the alternative thread. But the Gemara on that front says, front, ready, like frontlets between thine eyes. The Gemara on that front says, no, there is halacha. The halacha is that it has to be sinus, and Gamarnu, done with that conversation. But did we really resolve the one panel that was sewn together with linen? We didn't really resolve that question. If you make a total hekesh, if you make a total comparison between the laws of phylacteries in the sense that they are so detailed and absolute, and we rejected the notion that phylacteries could be sewn together with linen in the case that they're kind of coming apart and I need to put them back together, then you could say, fine, I can never do it with the Torah. But if you go the other direction, the idach, then you really have an open-ended conversation. Now, what do I do also with now the fact I just had this whole big conversation? We know the Gemara sometimes riffs when they have a machloket between two sages as above, with the words about the cities of refuge. The Gemara will go into another kind of issue because the very same sages argued about a different topic. But remember, it stemmed from the question, did Joshua, when he wrote, learn the law from Moses about the cities of refuge and just copy it over? Or did Joshua, late in the settlement of Israel game, or later, did Joshua really write the law with all those details that we're deciphering and discovering regarding the cities of refuge and regarding the Kohen Gadol's death and regarding all of this law about manslaughter? And what's the implication if it wasn't Moses and it was Joshua? That already we see a generation might need to define an area of law that a previous generation mentions only in another way, in say either a theoretical way or with some detail. Now that we said there were two places about cities of refuge when we started the chapter, right? The introduction was on page 43 of our Gemara. If you turn there, you don't have them, I don't think, in that version, but you might have, keeping your finger on Yud Aleph, you might go to the beginning of Perek Bet and see the Mekorot, because I think he'll bring the passages from Devarim and Bamidbar. There's a passage from Deuteronomy and a passage from Numbers on page 43. If the passage from Numbers was the one that Moses brought, and Deuteronomy were the verses that Joshua filled in, let's now read these verses again, because we'll really get our heads back around the issues. And we'll see whether or not it sounds like there was an expansion in Deuteronomy, or a little bit of a refinement in Deuteronomy, or it's just all integration and addition. And I just want to think about whether or not it was Moses telling both of them, and then Joshua copying, or it was Moses telling the one in Numbers, and Joshua kind of writing them back into Deuteronomy and into his own Sefer.
Is this why the discussion on who wrote it and so on, followed by how you put together the pages? Because it's as if Joshua took additional yarns and just wrote something and tacked it on. Why is it followed? There's no rationale. It's like discusses what Joshua wrote, and then it continues with how you put the Torah scroll together.
Good. So I think the connection is a little bit like this, which I hinted at or tried to say, but I'll say it again. How is law determined in our tradition? You could say that in Deuteronomy already, there's this notion that if they bring you a shaila, if they bring you a question that really is a wonder to you, it really is far from your understanding at first, because you don't have a definitive law or a definitive conclusion. And you have judges in your day, and the court in your day says, do left, do right, go left, go right, turn left, turn right. You have to accept the ruling, right? So does Numbers present the picture of what needs to be established, and then Deuteronomy and the book of Joshua create a Joshuan fulfillment of a Mosaic law? And two, could it be that Numbers and Deuteronomy are the Torah of Moses, the Torah of God, and Joshua is just trying to do his best in the book of Joshua to really make sure that all happens, because he's going to establish them, and he's going to, after he settles the land, have to put them into action. How does that relate to actually constructing a Torah scroll? It's used somewhat metaphorically, metonymically. We have to construct a society based on the laws in this book, and we have to stitch all of it together. And if we stitch it all together and one city doesn't behave like the rest of them, One panel is sewn together with linen. Is that okay? What happens when there are differences in 6 different cities of refuge? And by the way, we argued whether there were 6 or 42, or 42 plus 6, and they were 48. Because, the Torah says 6, but of course, Jews want to talk about, 42, 48. Are there going to be differences in the culture? Are there going to be different rabbis in different yeshivas? Are there going to be different marketplaces? Are there going to be different items available? Are there going to be different kinds of people living, depending on if they're on the one side of the Dead Sea or on the other side of the Dead Sea? You know that the cultural difference is city to city, right? So I think the questions that the rabbis have are that sophisticated, using the question of the Torah scroll itself, using the question of the tefillin themselves. On the other hand, I'll argue against that. Since they mentioned those rabbis, the way that the mind of the sages in our Chachamim worked was to say, since, by the way, we mentioned those sages, the best way we know to include those sages' argumentation about other matters, including the ritual, is to actually put them in and among the laws of damages and among the laws of criminals and criminal damages.
It's like stands in for something else.
Well, in the first one, in the first read.
Yeah.
In the second read, it's simply a matter of the organizational principles of the Chachamim that has less sophistication by way of literary connectivity. And it's, since I mentioned this sage and that he had an argument with this sage, I'm also going to now include this little argument about whether or not a Torah scroll can be written like that. The final and third possibility that I'll tell you is that, and again, this imagines that the rabbis were concerned that people who were involved in the court system were really getting into, being in law school and being judges and being on the Beit Din and living a life, right? They stuck tefillin and Torah in there to say, are you coming to shul? Are you davening? I wouldn't put it past them to, in a discussion about the laws of manslaughter, to stop and say, is it time to lay tefillin? Do you know what I mean? Like, you can live a life in community, but you still got to gather the minyan. So that's my third possibility. Back to this notion of numbers now. Let's read the numbers section first. No, right there, that page. Numbers on top, on 43. Up here, the paragraph from Numbers is the second paragraph. Then the congregation shall judge between the murderer and the blood redeemer according to these laws. Let me turn to 43 over here. No, it's good. It's good.
No, I won't.
Keep it close. Here it is. Then the congregation shall judge between the murderer and the blood redeemer according to these laws, and the congregation shall rescue the murderer from the hands of the blood redeemer, right? The congregation in this case are the people who live in the community. They're not going to let the blood redeemer do the actual blood redemption, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge that he fled there, and he shall dwell there until the death of the high priest, who was anointed with the sacred oil. And if the murderer shall at any time go beyond the border of his city of refuge, where he flees, and the blood redeemer finds him outside the border of his city of refuge, and the blood redeemer murders the murderer, he has no blood. In other words, he's not guilty, because the guy left the city of refuge before the priest died. For in his city of refuge he shall dwell until the death of the high priest. And after the death of the high priest, the murderer shall return to his ancestral land. And these matters shall be for you a statute of law unto you throughout your generations and all your dwellings. That's the high priest part in Numbers. So already that's how Numbers expresses the situation of the cities of refuge. Now, in Deuteronomy 19, Again, expansion, integration. You shall designate 3 cities for you in the midst of your land, which the Lord your God gives you to possess it. Prepare for you the road and divide the borders of your land, which the Lord your God causes you to inherit, into 3 parts, that every murderer may flee there. And this is the matter of the murderer who shall flee there and live. Who's the murderer that's actually going to get put into the city of refuge? Exiled there. Who kills his neighbor unawares, as he did not hate him from before. No mens rea. There was there's no motive. And as one who goes with his neighbor into the forest to hew wood, and his hand fetches a stroke with the axe to cut down the tree, and the blade displaces from the wood and finds his neighbor, and he dies. Right? Despite the OSHA regulations that your axe has to be really a secure and good axe, his axe head flew off and he killed his neighbor. He shall flee to one of these cities and live, lest the blood redeemer pursue the murderer while his heart is hot and overtake him, because the way is long, and strike him fatally. And for him there's no sentence of death, as he did not hate him from before. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall designate 3 cities for you. So there's no mention of the high priest dying in Deuteronomy. But there is this notion of Numbers having the high priest. And that's where we get this notion of the high priest in Numbers, but not in Deuteronomy. Okay, where did my phone go? Because that's my Tanakh. No? Okay.
Did you say your phone?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, very good.
I heard something drop before and
That's good. My phone is my Tanakh. So I have to now go look at one thing in the Tanakh that I want to share. So what's the Joshua one say? We're going to now I'm going to stop the share for a second. I'm going to pull up. Oh, I can't minimize because I'm in the middle of recording a meeting. You see, I don't know all the technological stuff. So I'm just going to read this to you. Those of you out there. He's in chapter 21 of Joshua. And they're talking about lots of times in Sefer Yehoshua, the book of Joshua, the division of lands. The fields of the city and its villages gave they to Caleb, the son of Yefuneh, for his possession. They gave to the descendants of Aaron, the priest, Hebron with its pasture lands, to be a city of refuge for the slayer, and Libnah with its pasture lands, and Yatir with its pasture lands. And so you have the notion of the cities of refuge within the different spaces and places of the different tribes. Goes on further. The tribe of Ephraim, for they gave them Shechem with its pasture lands. In other words, you get the geography and the layout of the land of Israel as it's inherited with all of the cities of refuge in Sefer Yehoshua. And from the tribe of Gad, Ramot and Gilad with its pasture lands, the city of refuge for the manslayer. So you see that the actual implementation sounds like it was only in Sefer Yehoshua. So back to the beginning of our Gemara and the question. Is all this about the cities of refuge being implemented in the book of Joshua? Because there was the ultimate delay in making sure the city of refuge was in place. That was the beginning of the discussion in that section of the Talmud that we read. Was there a delay between Moses' teaching, the idea that Joshua took the land, and then the implementation. Can I keep society together if we're going to be late in coming with good legal ideas like an Ir Miklat? I have to make sure I stitch it all together in the right way. I have to make sure that all the cities exist and they're stitched together by what? Remember, the Torah made a mention of this, and then the Gemara went and said very physically, I have to make roads. And all of them need to be connected to the different settlements of the Israelites. And what if one of those roads was somewhat impassable? Can we keep it all together, the whole system? Is it Torah coming alive in the right way if one of them is not functioning in the right way? To me, again, the discussion of the Torah scrolls and the phylacteries was simply yes, in and of itself, an interesting legal discussion, but a little bit at this point of asking about whether or not we've got everything stitched together in the right way, and Joshua has everything implemented in the right way thus far in the chapter with all the right roads that, if you recall, there were like about road signs and how to travel on them and how to travel the person to the city of refuge. And that's all stuff from that we learned together last year. And so the Talmud has an interest in setting out the laws in front of us, helping us stitch together society, implementing the laws of Deuteronomy and Numbers. And soon we'll get to a Mishnah that really deals with one of those details in the book of Numbers that is about the high priest dying, which releases a manslaughterer from his sentence in one of these refuge cities. But before that, we now kind of wrapped it up that Joshua has to and had to and did set them out in place, and they've all got to be, quote unquote, stitched together in the right way in order for society to function. Let's talk about this manslaughter getting freed from exile with the death of the Kohen Gadol in the next Mishnah we're about to learn. But before that, now we've kind of stitched everything together in the right way. At least the suggestion is you got to figure out the right way to keep it all together. Maybe you'll use some linen sometimes if you have to, but do it with sinews. It's got to be strong. A sinew is a lot stronger than a piece of linen thread. And linen thread, sometimes it's so thin, you can just simply snap it. The idea is we create a strong society. Just like we create the strong stitching between panels of a Torah, the strong stitching on a set of tefillin. Okay, so that's the literary use. I'll take questions and comments. Meira is speaking in the Beit Midrash.
No, I'm just musing over the image of Moses compared to Joshua, and the enormity of the task that was in front of them, and such a difference in the tasks. So Joseph, now here is Joshua, and he has to deal with a huge number of people in those tribes, and everybody wants different things, and have to implement the whole thing. It's not an idea anymore, and it's just enormous. So he writes, he katav b'sefer Torat Elohim, and I'm thinking he had a to-do list, and he had okay, this is what I need to do, and I check it off and check it off and check it off. And also the word Torah is, we treat think of Torah as the Torah, but it's also the teaching, the lehorot, the instructions. So to me, I hear that in the background of the word Torah. Torah Elohim, what God commanded. This is what I'm teaching. I was taught and I'm teaching it to you. Something like that. But I like the symbolism of keeping the stitches, things stitched together symbolically for society to be stitched together, because it was an enormous task. Yeah.
I really love that symbolism too. You know, it's one of the reasons why I think I see it within this passage of criminal law. And then all of a sudden, right, tefillin and Torah. Let's just say that again, right? Because they don't have to refer to those specific laws. They could have just said, did Joshua actually fulfill the commandment, or did Moses already start? And they could have had an argument about that. When did these cities really get built, and were they built the proper way? And it moved to this discussion. Amidst this kind of society building and criminal procedure, defining criminal procedure and criminal law regarding the manslaughter. And I love when tefillin and Torah meet the public square. Like, let's say it like that.
Yeah.
It is about the way we stitch together society, and are we stitching society together with the values that we treasure? And here the rabbis are kind of pushing that along side by side. The ritual law and the criminal law somehow help us define not only the way of approaching crime and punishment, but thinking about whether or not we ourselves are doing things in a kosher way. Because in the end, studying Torah and laying tefillin is a very personal ritual commandment. Right? No one comes and lays tefillin for you. Like I can be your shaliach in a certain way to say a bracha, to say a prayer. I can't really do it when it comes to laying tefillin. That is something you have to do on your own arm, on your own head. Thoughts from the virtual Beit Midrash? Questions? All right, go forward. Yeah? All right, page 71. Carol. And back to that Mishnah on 11a. Echad Mashuach. Yud Aleph.
I have it.
Now, let me remind you, we just read this passage from the Torah that said, when the Kohen Gadol, who shall be anointed with oil, when he dies, the manslaughterer is free. Here is a classic example of how the Mishnah comes and refines and expands sometimes. The Mishnah will also come and limit sometimes. So we don't want to say it only expands. But the Mishnah is edited in the year 200 CE by Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi. And as the rabbinic law is formed and formulated to understand what the Torah really is asking of us and demands of us, sometimes we get an expansion on a little part of a passage in the Torah, like the Kohen had to be anointed with special oil. Well, here's what the Mishnah is going to suggest by telling you that it's not just the Kohen who was anointed by oil. It's other kinds of Kohanim as well. First of all, the Mishnah is going to teach us what other kinds of Kohanim there were. And by the way, what happens when the case might be in the background? We lost the oil, or we don't have any more. Or there are other types of ways, maybe, that the historical system developed to actually anoint, if you will, now anoint in quotes as opposed to actual oil, to appoint instead of anoint a Kohen Gadol. And the Mishnah will tell us about some of that through what's called apodictic language. In other words, it's going to sound very much like rules and laws, but we're actually learning a little history here too, right? This is the way we write history as much as the way we write laws. That's the beautiful thing about rabbinic literature, because we're going to learn the history of how and who and what does it mean to become a Kohen Gadol, or a Kohen with the status of a Gadol. So look at the Mishnah with me. We, by the way, talked about this, those of us who were around in the Beit Midrash, when we were learning Avodah Zarah. No, I'm sorry. Sanhedrin. A couple of years ago, we learned all about the king and the Kohen Gadol, and who could be on trial, and who could testify, and who was could be a judge.
and who's not. Well, we over there met the whole quote unquote family of Kohanim and all the possible appointed high priests that were around. High priests, or at least people designated to be a high priest if the guy got sick. What do I do if the Kohen Gadol gets sick on Yom Kippur? Well, I have a machlif. I have someone who can switch him out. What do I do on any given day that I have a need for the high priest to do something and, God forbid, he's a human being. Something happens. I need another person who's maybe got the same status. The Mishnah says like this on 71. We're going to go and find it on the screen. Yep. What page are we on? Let's see. Hold on. Surfing. That's 151 already. Wow. Whoops. 119. $91. $77. So close. 75. 73. Okay.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah. Navigation. Okay, here's the Mishnah. Echad mashuach b'shemen hamishka. The Torah states that this unintentional murder is going to be freed now when the high priest is anointed. So high priests could be appointed, though, in several different ways, says the Mishnah. One is anointed with anointing oil. Right? The high priest is the head of the Kohenic groups that run the major ritual services in the Beit HaMikdash. We know from Torah that, in fact, there's an anointing oil and a method to anoint such an officer. Ve'echad hamirubei bivgadim. And here we also, though, hear that there's another way to be consecrated. One who is consecrated by donning the multiple garments. So you get the official uniform and you put them on, the 8 vestments unique to the high priest, which was the practice during the Second Temple period, because we say that we didn't know where the anointing oil was. There wasn't a recipe. So the way that they did it is they said, okay, fine, we're going to have the ceremony and the consecration will be because he dons the vestments and we have the right garments. Ve'echad, and there's more, she'avar mimshichuto machsirin et haroteh. And we also say if one was appointed who received a temporary appointment due to some reality that the high priest himself couldn't serve. If that one died, he also releases the manslaughterer. Even if he departed from his anointment with the restoration of the serving high priest to active service.
Can you do it? Can you resign Kohen Gadol?
You don't just resign. You're displaced because the high priest comes. He comes back to service.
Oh,
So wait, there's a high priest now, And there's one who was appointed there for 2 days because the high priest, quote unquote,
Mhm.
was on sick leave. But then the guy who actually was machlif, the guy who was actually appointed for those 2 days, he dies.
Mhm.
The Mishnah just told us that even though he's no longer the high priest and serving in that role, if he dies, the guy from the city of exile is free.
It's a nice.
Oh.
What's the logic?
So
There isn't.
we're gonna look. We're gonna see in the Talmud whether or not there's any logic behind all this. And we've been wondering that since last year, which is why we're coming back to this. Is the Gemara gonna tell us about any kind of logic?
No.
Well, it's gonna suggest something about the Kohen Gadol. But before that, we'll read through the Mishnah and we'll see what we can learn just from the Mishnah itself. Let's learn a little bit more. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda himself says he's the editor of the Mishnah. Af Mashuach Milchama Machzir Tarotech. He says there's another type of Kohen that we also have who has the status of being Maspik Gadol or like a Kohen Gadol. He's the one who is the anointed for war priest. So I have a general of sorts. Back in the time that I really believed that I needed the Kohen Gadol to lead the way, I have the priest who's the military priest. And if he dies, then the manslaughter is released from the city of refuge.
So it's like a Rav Tzvai in Israel.
Exactly.
But is that
Mira is
comparable?
asking, is it like a rabbi who serves in the Israel Defense Forces?
Yeah.
So that's basically it. There's a Rav in IDF who has the quote unquote, same high status
Yeah.
as Rabbanim in the major other parts of the rabbinate.
It's like war requires a certain philosophy, a religious philosophy, a
Well,
different type of approach.
I mean, look, in the ancient world, war required that God would be on your side.
Of course.
Let's just say, forget
Yeah.
philosophy.
Right.
They said, God, did we do what we needed to? Are you on our side? Are we going to kibosh our enemies?
Right.
That's the,
You're
you know,
right.
that I think was more their hope. Who knows if they were hoping for a miracle? Lefichach. Therefore, listen to this. Since we know that it's the deaths of the Kohen Gadol or the Kohanim that freed the manslaughterers, Lefichach, imotehen shel Kohanim misapkot lahen michya uchsut kadesha lo yipalalu al bneihem sheyamutu.
Mhm.
The mothers of the high priests would come to the exiled cities with all kinds of goodies
Mhm.
and clothes so that they wouldn't pray there that their sons would die. Because the mothers really did their job to try to make sure everybody was comfortable in these cities of refuge. Now, again, are you going to call them jails? Like, we understand, like, it seems so rough and harsh. Or are we going to call them, like, even the mothers had an association, the mothers of the Kohanim, the top mothers, had an organization to be sure that everybody there was comfortable enough. They weren't praying
Mhm.
for the death of the high priest. They wanted them to live there and not try to hope or pray that the Kohanim would be killed.
Yeah.
Now that is, in and of itself, an incredible mission. First of all, back to page, no, I'm not going to turn on the screen, but just I'm going to read you again. Back to Deuteronomy and Numbers. Until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the sacred oil. It didn't say who was consecrated with the 8 vestments, the garments. It didn't say in Numbers who was switched in for a high priest who couldn't serve. It didn't say who was given the appointment as Kohen of the military. But the Mishnah expanded on our verse so that we have a deeper understanding of the law as it existed and as it could and should exist, according to the sages. The mothers, I mean, what do you make of the mothers? Professor Marjorie Lehman at the seminary has an entire kind of Torah of Jewish mothers that appear in the Talmud. And obviously, this is a very big representation of what a mother does for a son, who's the Kohen. Mothers who have sons who are Kohanim, who serve God, is a theme that we know already from lots of different famous passages. We just came from reading Hannah, who's going to dedicate her child to the service of God. Eli, the high priest, in the book of Shmuel, in the book of Samuel. And she wanted him to serve deeply and helped kind of sustain the priesthood. A mother sustaining the priesthood is not far off over there, by way of a model of just a mother dedicated to the priesthood enough to send her son to be part of it. Over here, she realizes that her son's job is dangerous in yet a different way. Not just sacrificial fires, not just the kind of dedication of life in the temple, but life in the temple where there's a certain amount of responsibility for what's going on in the entirety of the land of Israel, the greater land of Israel. Even though there are some tribal leaders, even though there are military leaders, there seems to be some kind of great power in the Cohen's role by way of keeping those cities of refuge filled with the people who deserve to be there. And then when he dies, things are set back on course to get those folks back to their ancestral homelands. And at that point, any blood avenger would have blood on his hands, would be guilty of murdering someone who had paid his price, done his time. Some natural questions. What's the logic? Some natural questions. Wait a minute. But if one guy's in for 10 years and one guy is in for 1 day and the Cohen dies, how do I explain the difference?
To all the people in there when he dies. Get out.
Everybody who's a manslaughter.
I have a conundrum here.
So his life is he's a hunted man.
You would say
You
so.
would
And,
think.
and thusly the mothers
Yes,
are really, really
they
open.
gotta be laying it on thick.
Really thick. Really thick.
Is that the secret origin of the Jewish mother?
Well, so let's push that, what we think about the mothers in the Talmud. Is this the secret origin of the Jewish mother, right? It was not, I have a good kugel. I have really yummy Shabbos food. Sit, eat. I was listening to comedy yesterday. And he said, he was talking about Italian mothers and Jewish mothers. And he said, so not every one of my friends was either Italian or Jewish. And they had to learn how to eat dinner at my house because it's always nice. Like, let's just stay for dinner. So my friends would stay for dinner. I said, here's the code. First of all, you're going to get a lot of food. You're going to finish. Now, if you get the question, you want some more? And you really don't want like a whole lot more. What you say is, oh, I could only eat a bite more. And then you eat what is plopped down on your plate in front of you as the whole next, the meal. And if you really want just like a lot more, just say, I could eat a little. So it's very fun.
Play it out. But I have a conundrum about the whole idea of praying for the Cohen's death. It implies that those prayers have some power
Oh, yeah.
and they're real. So they're even-handed. The Kohen has a status, the Kohen has power, a direct line to God, and here are the criminals praying, and those prayers have power over something. That's paganism. That doesn't sit well. It's a conundrum.
I don't know if it's paganism.
Not paganism, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I do know what you're saying. But let's take it a different way.
Human nature.
Let's take it a different way. There's a recognition that even the people who are paying for their crimes,
Mhm.
who are in these cities of exile, they're able to pray. That is one piece here,
But they
like on
pray
a
for
positive
something
level.
evil.
On a positive level, like
Yeah.
they still are people who do have the power of prayer.
Okay.
I don't think necessarily it's as much about the magic of prayer leading to death as it is the recognition that, just like in our lives sometimes, I pray for good parnasa, right? I pray for a good living.
Mm.
I'm, as much as I would love it, by the way, I'm not expecting Hashem to send me $1 million sitting on my bench.
Right.
I'm wrapping my tefillin and all of a sudden, oh, look.
Yep.
You know, they're praying, they're scheming, they're thinking it through. We don't have a magical notion, even within rabbinic times.
Mhm.
Even when we talk about prayer and moving God,
Mm.
even when the Hasidim and mystics talk about Hitorut de La'ila,
I know what you
the
mean.
stirring of God on high, we're not talking about magic.
Okay,
So I think we have to be cognizant of that all the time when we read into that.
got it.
But I do think it means, like, you know, she doesn't want any scheming going on. She wants to be really integrated, not only laying it on thick, they want, you know, the mothers have spies. This is the beginning of the books about the women who were really the spies in the world. Any comments, questions from the virtual Beit Midrash? Rich?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I wasn't clear, who gets to appoint these Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol of various kinds? Because I'm not, to me, I'm thinking this whole system, which is you have manslaughterers who spend some undefined amount of time and are protected. And then when they're released, they're protected only in the sense that if a blood avenger came after them, that would be murder. Okay, and therefore not accepted. Apparently in the system before then, that would be acceptable. But obviously an earlier time than later jurisprudence. But I can only think that whoever gets to appoint them would be under some kind of pressure to appoint, let's say, mature Kohanim who were well up in years, because you don't want too many of them around for like 20 or 30 years. You want some of them to be going more frequently. So I'm just wondering, how does this work?
I mean, you know, I'm not sure. I don't have a record of how old they were and how many years any one of them lived and how often there was a death so that manslaughterers could be freed from cities of refuge, as if they were appointing them, you know, at the right times that way. I'm sure they want to send anyone out to battle who didn't, you know, have some capacity to do. But the history, a quick review of that history of the Kohenic group, right? We said that Moses was told to appoint Aaron. The Aharonite families had both Levitical and Kohenic jobs. Aaron's family became the Kohen Gadol, and for a long time in Jewish history, the line of Aaron is the line of the high priest. Comes along in the Tanakh, in Sifrei Shmuel, in the books of Samuel, the notion that Tzadok becomes the high priest and the Tzadokite line is started. It's familial. We're not sure his entire background. And so we just see that there's a shift. We imagine that it's connected to Aharonite Kohanim. And I think that the appointment of the high priest is probably internal to the leadership of the family. And also when we have a king and a recognized king leader, part of what is agreed upon between the king and the Navi, the prophets, and the internal system of Kohenic leadership that is an essential both servant and religious leader within the community, and remember, one who teaches Torah law, as it says in the books of prophets. In the days post Ezra, remember that it winds up that the power grabs in Israel among the Judean leadership. They try to consolidate the office of king and high priest. And this is about what we were reading, some of that history in Sanhedrin when we studied that chapter. Is the high priest separate from the king? Is the king the high priest? Was some of what we were reading about the warning that if you're going to combine the office of king and high priest and not have it be about the two different offices or the lineage line, and you're just going to usurp it, this is going to start to cause us some significant problems. Mm-hmm. And so the destruction of the temple comes along, and we only remember the Kohenic line by calling them up first to the Torah, by having them do the Zimun for Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after the meal. We ask, is there a Kohen in the house? And ask the Kohen to lead it according to tradition. We may not necessarily follow all those halachot within our community, but this is the kind of way we remember the status. Even though sometimes the status of people as a Kohen already in halachic sources and Jewish legal sources is called into question, right? It's like fake. There's a doubt. But we still have that. And in traditional communities, of course, Kohanim go to bless the people in Jerusalem and Israel every day. And in many communities on Yom Tov, you have the Kohenic blessing, where the Kohanim are under the talit and their hands are out. So that's the quick history. And there is an internal system, but it starts very much connected to Moses appointing Aaron and Aaron appointing family, and then Tzadok in the Tanakh, in the age of the Tanakh.
So I have one question,
Yeah.
which is a little off the subject, but what is the whole thing about don't look at the Kohanim?
So Carol's asking about that. Why don't we look at the Kohen during the Kohenic blessing? So there's an aversion of our eyes based on the fact that we hope that the radiance of God or God's effluence or God's shining presence will come. And we kind of, in that hope, avert our eyes. Not that we actually see the brilliance and it will blind us, but in the hope that there's like some kind of countenance that God's shining on our face, and it's coming through the Kohen saying this, but not that the Kohen has that power. Sources then say, but what if you look?
Yeah.
Because they know that we're just human. And all of them say, not to worry, the children are going to look. Because like there's this whole tradition of putting your kids underneath the talus for the Kohen Gadol's blessing. And it's really about the closeness and godliness at that time. And you're kind of averting and you're looking towards your children under your talus. I will tell you that there's a qualitative difference in, and it's just a reality. And so I'm, sharing it with you as a matter of personal journaling, I'll pay. There's a qualitative difference, I think, in the power of blessing that my children, Shaya and Ziv, felt, and Shuli underneath my talit, because of the fact that we were in a congregation during their childhood where the Kohanim gave the blessing and that we wrapped them up for holidays. And Yonah never had that experience because we don't have that here at Orzaru. And I would say that it wasn't just me and the feeling that I got, but it was a feeling that they got, that there was a protective nature. But that's all to say that Shuli was the curious one. and she would move the talus, and she would look, and I was not concerned that she was going to be struck down or anything because of the Cohen's fire or something like that. It's only healthy that they should look and be curious about Jewish life. So, all right, folks, it's 8:52. We've learned the Mishnah. Ron, did you have something before I?
Yes, I have a
Okay.
question in regards to the Kohanim. Could it be that there were more than one Kohen Gadol at the same time? For example, somebody had to stay in the temple and somebody had to go with the soldiers if there was a war. So there were two Kohanim servicing at the same time.
Well, what we say is that they had equal status by way of this Mishnah about their deaths. And so even though their rankings were kind of the same, we have different names for them. Kohen Mashuach Milchama, Kohen Gadol, Kohen Machlif. But all of them, yes, according to this Mishnah, which is so interesting, have this status where if they die, they release the manslaughterer from the city of refuge, and not just the Mashuach with the anointing oil. So yes, the answer is yes, there is an interesting sharing on like how many 5-star generals can the army have? They can have a couple at a time.
So it's good to kill somebody at the time of war. Because
Well,
then because if the Kohen Mashuach Milchama is dying, the guy is released.
well, it is a question that the mothers of the Kohen Gadol that they have. Are we really setting these people up for paying the highest price? And they want to make sure that at least it's not coming, the prayers are not coming from the cities of refuge. Is it good? That's a loaded statement you just made, which you know. Is it ever good? Well, Tov doesn't necessarily mean only good. It means the better choice right now, based on situations and based on the realities that I have. What's the better choice between this or that? So just on the war front itself, which you mentioned, there is a whole question about the ethics of war and when it's okay to be defending ourselves and what happens with life and death at the time in prison. That's a whole different subject. But in terms of the Kohens being killed, would they pray that when we go to war, that Kohen Gadol pays with his life so I can get out of this Ir Miklat? Well, the mothers are making sure that these are really wonderful places to live. So maybe they're not so inclined. And the reality is this. These are settlements, we've read about them, that have marketplaces and centers of learning and family life, and they have citizens who are manslaughterers, and they have others who are not, who move in. Remember, it said you can't really have one of these cities unless you have neighborhoods filled with people who both are considered quote unquote criminals the way we would think about them in our modern minds, and who are not. And so there's not really a sense that they want to get out of these places so fast. And that maybe they tried to make life really good in these new settlements and kind of in a mishaneh makom mishaneh mazal. You change the place, you change your stars, your luck, and you live a life that's full. And I'm not sure that we're so concerned, but you could see the fiction, you could see the fan fiction, you could see the movie plot. The couple of people who live in that city of refuge who are
Waiting.
plotting and hiring and waiting and who are the ones to make sure that either this Kohen or that Kohen pays with his life so we can get the heck out of here. And that's the tension here is like it is part of the system. And so what are we going to do with this fact that it exists? The Gemara is going to go from here and try to understand what's really happening here. Why is this the system that's in place? And is there some other system that we learn from this Is it only the example? Or are we talking for real about what happened here? Or is this just somehow we have to learn a lesson through this? Because really, we exist in a time where there are no Kohanim Gedolim. We're now post-temple. There's no Kohen Gadol. So if we had a system where we were putting manslaughters in a city of refuge and we don't have a Kohen Gadol anymore, what is the analog to this system of having a Kohen Gadol who has to die in order for these people to be freed? What do we do now? And that's where the rabbis are, because it's post-destruction Jewish world. So everybody, have a great night. It was good to start learning again at Beit Midrash, and we'll be back next week, same time. See you soon.
Thank you. Good night.
I have a
Thank
question.
you. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
I still want